Today's mindful moment. Can the very thing we call freedom subtly become its own cage?
That's a powerful way to put it.
Today we're plunging into James Kalb's The Tyranny of Liberalism, a book that really flips the script on our assumptions about modern liberty and asks if it might be, well, more restrictive than we think.
It's a challenging read, for sure. Kalb's argument really hinges on how he sees liberalism viewing the world. He traces its roots back to, modern science, this urge to understand everything through a lens of measurement and practical results.
Okay, so like quantifiable data and efficiency.
Exactly. And this creates a natural suspicion, he argues, toward older forms of knowledge, things based on tradition or authority that can't be easily measured or tested in a lab.
Right. So if we apply this sort of scientific method to human affairs, does Kalb believe we end up losing sight of deeper values? Focusing instead on just like ticking boxes of individual desires?
That's precisely his point. Kalb argues liberalism adopts what he calls a technological understanding of human affairs. It becomes about observing what people want their preferences and then efficiently delivering it. And this focus on satisfying preferences, he says, can overshadow the idea of inherent human goods, things that might be good for us whether we actively desire them right now or not.
And this leads straight into his really provocative claim. The triumph of liberalism means the tyranny of liberalism. That's a bold statement. What's the core of this supposed tyranny?
Well, Kalb contends that once liberalism becomes the dominant worldview, the sort of default setting for society, it inevitably struggles to tolerate or even really understand viewpoints that don't share its fundamental assumptions.
Like what kind of viewpoints?
Perspectives rooted in tradition, religion, or concepts like natural law. These can get marginalized, seen as outdated, irrational, or even, harmful to individual autonomy.
So, the freedom promised by liberalism is Kalb suggesting it comes with invisible strings attached. He mentions this term, administered freedom. What does that actually entail?
Yeah, administered freedom. Think of it as freedom that's kind of granted and managed by authorities, the state, maybe large corporations, bureaucratic systems. It's not necessarily a freedom you inherently possess, but one that's given and regulated by these entities operating within that liberal framework.
Okay.
The catch, Kalb argues, is that this management, while it might seem to expand choices in some ways, can inadvertently limit the real spectrum of thought and social organization. It's like having a lot of options on a restaurant menu, but someone else already decided what kinds of dishes could even be considered for the menu in the first place.
That makes sense. And the standard liberal principle of maximum equal freedom, giving everyone as much of what they want as possible, as equally as possible, that also comes under Kalb's scrutiny.
Yes, very much so. While it sounds equitable on the surface, who wouldn't want maximum equal freedom? Kalb argues this relentless pursuit of satisfying individual preferences can erode the very institutions that have historically provided stability and meaning.
Like family and community.
Exactly. Consider the family, religious organizations, local communities. They often function based on more than just aggregating individual desires at a given moment. They have their own internal logic, maybe shared traditions, obligations, commitments that go beyond immediate preference. Kalb suggests that pushing constantly for maximum individual freedom can weaken these crucial social structures.
Now, here's a point that really jumped out at me. Kalb believes this isn't just some accidental side effect. He actually argues that liberalism, in its modern form, benefits specific groups, particularly commercial and managerial elites. How does he figure that works?
It's a key part of his critique. Kalb's insight is that these elites tend to favor a society that is, rationally organized, predictable, and manageable. Institutions like strong, independent families or deeply rooted religious communities, or even just tight-knit local cultures, can be less easily controlled. They might hold values that compete with a purely market-driven logic or centralized administration.
So they're less predictable.
Less predictable, less standardized. Liberalism, with its emphasis on individual autonomy, market principles, and often centralized regulation to ensure that autonomy, can create a more standardized, rationalized, and ultimately manageable social environment. Kalb argues this aligns pretty neatly with the interests of those who manage large commercial or governmental organizations.
So it's almost like the liberal state starts stepping in to take over roles that were previously held by these more traditional local groups, leading to a centralization of power.
Precisely. Kalb sees a definite trend where functions once handled within local communities and families, things like education, welfare, social care, even defining norms are increasingly absorbed by the state and large bureaucratic systems. This shift, he warns, can inadvertently weaken those vital local connections, those human bonds, and shared senses of identity that aren't based purely on individual choice or state definition.
And this seems to lead directly into his later work, The Decomposition of Man, and his whole analysis of the modern identity crisis. It sounds like he sees liberalism's impact going even deeper than just politics or economics.
Absolutely. In The Decomposition of Man, Kalb really expands on this, exploring how liberalism, by emphasizing individual self-creation and de-emphasizing unchosen identities, can weaken traditional sources of identity, things like, well, man, woman, husband, wife, member of a specific nation or faith.
Right, that sort of given categories.
The given categories. While promoting new, often constructed or chosen identities might be seen as liberating, and often is, Kalb worries it can also lead to a kind of social disorientation, a sense of rootlessness. As these traditional anchors fade, he suggests, individuals might become more reliant on commercial culture brands, consumer choices, and administrative systems, state classifications, therapeutic definitions to define themselves and find their place in the world.
It's a complex picture. So how does this dominant liberal worldview actually maintain its position, according to Kalb? He points to some specific mechanisms, doesn't he?
He does. He identifies 4 key ways this happens. First, there's linguistic control, the strategic use of language. Think about terms like diversity, inclusiveness, equality. Kalb argues these can be used not just to promote certain values, but also sometimes to shut down opposing arguments without engaging them, labeling them as inherently prejudiced or outmoded.
Okay, language is one.
Second, academic capture. The idea that educational institutions, from schools to universities, increasingly transmit and reinforce a primarily liberal orthodoxy, making it harder for alternative viewpoints to get a serious hearing. Third, legal enforcement, things like anti-discrimination laws, which, while often aimed at just goals, can be interpreted and expanded in ways that extend liberal principles into almost every area of life, sometimes overriding traditional practices or beliefs.
And the fourth?
And fourth, media influence. The power of cultural institutions, news media, entertainment, the arts in shaping norms and promoting values that align with a broadly liberal outlook.
And this combination results in something he calls inquisitorial tolerance. That sounds pretty unsettling.
It does sound paradoxical, doesn't it? Inquisitorial tolerance, as Kalb uses it, describes a situation where tolerance is generously extended, but only to those viewpoints that fall within the acceptable boundaries of liberal thought.
So tolerance with conditions.
Exactly. Any ideas that significantly deviate from these core liberal principles, individual autonomy as the highest good, skepticism of tradition, etc., can be met with condemnation, social exclusion, sometimes even legal consequences. It effectively stifles genuine fundamental debate by predefining what counts as a tolerable opinion. You can explore more perspectives on complex ideas like these on Mindful Moments and our podcasts, which is an AI audiobook analysis YouTube channel.
It's really fascinating to think about the historical arc here.
Yeah.
Kalb does touch on liberalism's evolution, right? He even references Alan Kahan's Freedom from Fear, which highlights that original drive, the desire to prevent arbitrary power and religious warfare.
That's a really crucial point to remember. Kalb isn't necessarily saying liberalism was always this way or that its original aims were bad. Kahn's work points out that liberalism arose, in part, from a very real desire to protect individuals from tyranny, from violence, from oppressive state or religious control. That motivation for freedom from fear was powerful and, many would argue, noble.
But Kalb thinks something shifted.
Kalb argues that this initial, understandable goal has morphed over time. It's evolved, he suggests, into an ideology that increasingly seeks to dismantle any limitations on individual autonomy, even those limitations that might come from nature, tradition, or community, and which he believes might actually be necessary for a healthy, functioning society. He traces this shift from, Enlightenment skepticism through the rise of modern science and capitalism all the way to today's focus on identity politics, noting what he sees as a consistent weakening of traditional forms of authority and connection along the way.
Okay, so given all these pretty serious concerns, what alternative does Kalb actually propose? He's not just advocating for, like, a simple rewind to the Middle Ages, is he?
No, absolutely not. Kalb is quite clear, I think, that simply trying to turn back the clock to some bygone era isn't realistic or even desirable. History moves forward. Instead, he calls for a kind of renewal, a revitalization of traditional, often more local and decentralized forms of social organization. He believes these human-scaled communities and institutions offer a more resilient and ultimately more fulfilling path forward than ever-expanding individualism and centralized administration.
And what are the core elements of this renewal he envisions? What should be revitalized?
He emphasizes four main areas. First, a renewed appreciation for tradition and concepts like natural law, the idea that there are some inherent truths about human nature and morality. Second, a strengthening of local communities empowering neighborhoods, towns, voluntary associations. Third, a revitalization of religion, which he sees as a crucial source of meaning, morality, and social confusion. He personally focuses quite a bit on Catholicism. And fourth, a strong defense of the traditional family as a fundamental social unit.
And he uses contemporary issues, like debates over same-sex marriage, for instance, as examples of where these traditionalist principles clash with liberal ones.
Yes, he often uses concrete social issues to illustrate the conflict between a worldview based on maximizing individual autonomy and choice, and one based on tradition, natural order, and the inherent purposes of institutions like marriage. For him, these aren't just isolated policy debates, they represent this deeper philosophical clash.
It seems his work has definitely struck a chord, particularly with certain groups of thinkers. We see quotes praising it as, an outstanding contribution or simply unsurpassed in its analysis.
Indeed, Kalb's analysis, while controversial, has been quite influential among many traditionalist and conservative intellectuals. People like Paul Gottfried or Robert Jackal have praised his ability to drill down to what they see as the fundamental logic and consequences of modern liberalism. His work resonates deeply with those who feel that liberalism, perhaps despite its good intentions, has gone too far in its pursuit of individual autonomy at the expense of community, tradition, and objective truth. You see echoes of his themes in other critics, too, like Patrick Deneen.
So really, at the heart of Kalb's critique, it seems there's a fundamentally different understanding of what freedom is. It's not just about having endless options, is it?
Exactly right. That's a crucial takeaway. Kalb often looks back to classical and medieval thought, contrasting the modern liberal idea of freedom as maximizing individual choice and minimizing constraints with an older concept, sometimes called libertas. Libertas. This older view sees freedom more as the ability to achieve one's true end, to flourish as a human being, which often involves living virtuously within certain natural and social constraints within a strong community. It's about self-mastery and participation in a shared good rather than just, maximizing personal options. It's a very different concept from the radical individualism he critiques in modern liberalism.
And it's probably worth briefly noting Kalb's own background here. He's coming at this as, well, an independent scholar, but also a lawyer educated at places like Dartmouth and Yale. He's not just theorizing in a complete vacuum.
Correct. Having a background in law dealing with the practical application of principles and regulations likely gives him a particular perspective. His other works, like Against Inclusiveness and the more recent The Decomposition of Man, continue these themes. He definitely situates himself within a tradition of conservative and traditionalist thought that questions the trajectory of modern Western societies. His experiences likely inform his understanding of how abstract liberal principles actually play out in the real world, in legal systems and social structures.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, exploring some really challenging ideas. Just to quickly recap for everyone, what's the absolute essence of Kalb's tyranny of liberalism?
At its core, it's the intolerance that he argues inevitably arises when liberalism becomes the dominant, unquestioned ideology, leading it to marginalize or suppress non-liberal viewpoints and ways of life.
And how specifically does he see liberalism undermining those traditional institutions?
Primarily by prioritizing individual preference and rational administration over the inherent goods and traditional functions of things like family, religion, and local community. Market logic and bureaucratic management tend to displace older forms of social bonds.
And who does he believe ultimately benefits most from this dominance?
He points to commercial and managerial elites, arguing they favor the rationalized, predictable, and controllable social structures that liberalism tends to foster.
Right. And just to be crystal clear, is he arguing for a complete rejection of liberalism and a return to some pre-liberal past?
No, not a simple return. He argues more for a revitalization of traditional institutions and principles within a modern context, suggesting they are necessary for true human flourishing.
Okay. And what's his proposed path forward, those key elements?
It's that four-part focus: a renewed emphasis on tradition and natural law, strengthening local communities, revitalizing religion, and defending the family unit.
And finally, what sort of evidence or trends does he point to as signs of liberalism's potential downsides or failures?
He often cites broader societal trends, things like rising rates of depression or anxiety, family breakdown, social fragmentation, confusion about identity, maybe even certain kinds of political instability, suggesting these are linked to the erosion of traditional sources of meaning and connection that liberalism facilitates.
This has certainly been a very thought-provoking exploration of James Kalb's The Tyranny of Liberalism. It leaves you wondering, doesn't it? Does the relentless pursuit of individual autonomy, even with the best intentions, unintentionally pave the way for new, perhaps more subtle forms of societal constraint?
It's a heavy question. And what is the role of tradition and community in fostering genuine human flourishing, maybe in ways that go beyond the framework that modern liberalism provides?
These are definitely vital questions for our time, questions worth wrestling with.
Absolutely.
Indeed. If this exploration has sparked your curiosity and maybe challenged some assumptions, we really encourage you to subscribe and share this discussion with others who might find it interesting. You can also purchase The Tyranny of Liberalism. We'll put a hypothetical link in the description for you. Most importantly, though, continue to think critically about the dominant ideologies that shape our world.